In the beginning, God created four-dimensional existence. Before that, well, there was no before that, as there was no such thing as time, nor form, and therefore no movement. All was a dark void. No, we can't even call it dark, because that would assume the existence of light, just as the digit 0 assumes the existence of other numbers. Only null, the non-existence of any state or number or concept or the space to put it in. From whatever dimension or state of existence he possesses, God's Spirit brooded over the null and void, conceptualizing matter, which therefore existed as a microscopic speck. All of space consisted only of that speck. Apart from that speck, there was no space. Then God said, "Let there be light." Movement began, and thus the dimension of time. The speck exploded into a vast cloud of photons shooting outward in every direction. The light shone from the center, the beginning of time, outward in a straight line to the end of time. Viewed from within that dimension, it appeared as an ever-expanding universe of pure whiteness. Then God said, "Let the light be separated from the darkness." Because of the rapid expansion immediately following the explosion, gravitational waves rippled through the stream, causing energy to swirl, forming galaxies. The vacuum that was left, those areas where darkness prevailed, God called night, and those parts affected by the light, day. In all of this whirling of galaxies and the gravitational pull, stars were formed, and then planets. On some planets, God saw to it that the conditions would be such that water could exist in three states simultaneously, in solid, liquid, and gas. And that an atmosphere would surround those planets. And so the universe consisted of galaxies that contained stars and solar systems, with planets of all sizes and types, some no more than rocks, others mostly glass, but some with molten cores and having an atmosphere which presented other possibilities that God intended to put to use. Thus, God looked over his four-dimensional space-time, beginning with a burst of light at the center, developing into a geometric spirals of energy and matter, evolving into orderly patterns, ever expanding outward to the end of time. God, from whatever dimension he possesses, saw it all from the beginning to end, and thought that it was beautiful, and called it a day. The next day, in whatever dimension he possesses, God turned his attention to one of the planets with a molten core that had an atmosphere and water existing in three states. First, by causing lava flows and by shifting the continental plates, he made the land separate from the water, forming oceans and continents. Then God said, "Let there be molecules configured in such a way as to hold life, and let them reproduce and adapt so as to fill the earth with life after its own kind." And deep below the surface of the ocean, DNA cells began to form. Plant life began to spring up. Simple life forms provided nourishment for the more complex, which in the end of their own life cycle became food for the others of their kind, all the while reproducing themselves through their seeds and shoots. Thus, to the end of time, the planet was filled with self-sustaining, multicolored life. God, from whatever dimension he possesses, let's call it the fifth dimension, looked on his four-dimensional space-time and said, "It is good," and again called it a day. On another day of the fifth dimensional time, God said, "Let there be living creatures that move about, swimming in the sea, flying in the air, and walking and creeping on the dry ground. They can eat the vegetation and become food for one another, and at the end of their life cycle, they become food for the vegetation." Thus the whole earth began to come alive with movement. Creatures moving, swimming, creeping, flying, making noise, making music. Each creature, acting according to its need and instinct, followed a course that could be predetermined by taking into account every factor and every movement in the universe. A butterfly living at the beginning of the age of butterflies by flapping its wing one way or another, could affect the course of a tropical storm near the end of the age of tropical storms. Of course, how the butterfly flapped its wings was also the predictable result of yet other factors. When some of the species became so large as to take over and inhibit the further development of life, they were destroyed by a large asteroid, which was simply following its predictable course. God looked at this and said, "It is good, but not good enough." The whole universe was nothing but a big toy, and after some shifting and tweaking, and doing things like flicking a butterfly or adding to the gravitational pull of a small rock in space so that it would strike an asteroid, putting it onto a course to destroy the dinosaurs a few eons later, thus making room for mammals, God decided the four-dimensional space-time needed something more innovative, something that would make it complete, less predictable, a true work of art, fully expressing his creative and loving nature. Actually, it was a thing God had in mind from the very beginning. God created a new life form, unique from all the others, humanity. The human was capable of true creativity, independent of his need to survive, his instinct, or anything that limited the other creatures to a predetermined course. In fact, the human was created after God's own pattern. Thus, humanity would contribute to the final design of the four-dimensional space-time. The main difference was that humans were limited to being conscious of the fourth dimension only one moment at a time, not seeing it from the beginning to end, as God does. Thus, if you think about it, it's the only way humans can possibly influence space-time through unpredetermined choices, all the while God knowing about those choices beforehand simply by viewing the entire space-time from beginning to end. God can and does influence the final design by interaction with humans through various means of communication, influencing their choice through suggestions, sometimes enabling those humans to perform miracles. Thus, the final step of the four-dimensional space-time is a collaborative effort between God and the human race, which God designed to be both a part of and as a fellow artist in the project. However, there is also a downside to this whole plan. Humanity is also capable of choices to do or not to do what God wishes, even violating specific instructions. That factor is necessarily part of being designed in God's image, unlimited by predeterminism. One day, humanity partook of an element that he was specifically instructed to leave alone. It affected him in such a way that he wasn't prepared for, giving humanity consciousness of good and evil. Humanity was already creative, but now his consciousness was skewed by the need to constantly compare things by their rightness, their desirability, and superiority. This opened up many dark areas that humanity wasn't ready for. The action had such repercussions that it was as though shock waves reverberated through the whole of four-dimensional space-time, threatening to shatter it. It's possible that, as viewed from God's perspective, it did begin to shatter. God's remedy was to absorb that shock. To understand the concept of shock and absorption of shock, we could either delve into the laws of physics, or we could use a simple illustration from judo. People being trained in judo are taught how to fall. Being thrown to the ground, or even falling backwards, can cause a serious injury if one doesn't know how to break one's fall, because of the shock waves going through the body. To prevent injury, one simply slaps the floor just before the back of the head hits the ground. The hand may smart, but the head stays intact, because the hand has absorbed the shock waves. As we talk further about the strategy of absorbing the shock, think about a judo fighter slapping the ground as he falls. Interacting with various humans, especially those of the family clan of Abraham through Isaac and Jacob, God set up a framework whereby he would continue to cooperate with humanity to enact his plans to both absorb the shock and restore everything to a beautiful state. An important part of that framework was the institution of blood sacrifice. Death can be viewed as simply the end of a natural cycle, a part of the nature. Untimely death, however, is something that continues to send shock waves through the four-dimensional space-time. Causing untimely death to a fellow human without just cause is what we call murder. God told Noah and his sons that murder must be atoned for by the death of the perpetrator. Only by that means is a shock wave absorbed so that it does no further damage to space-time, like a slap on the floor. Blood sacrifice is another means of using death as a means of absorbing shock. The agreement God made with Abraham and his descendants, given in detail to Moses, provided for blood sacrifice on a regular basis. This was sufficient to temporarily hold back the damage from the great shock wave. Thus, Israel played a vital role in preserving the universe by becoming, as it were, the provider of a multitude of slaps on the floor. It is indicated in the Talmud that when Israel was at Mount Sinai, they saved the world from destruction by accepting God's terms and ratifying the covenant God made with Abraham. However, that was not yet enough. It was only the preparation for God's ultimate solution. God sent an instance of himself, his word, to a critical time location in a space-time to be born as a human, with the attributes of the human, including the ability to have independent choice. He had all the authority of a human, including the option of communicating with God through the Holy Spirit. So his action would constitute those of a human from inside four-dimensional space-time. Though he was from outside space-time, where he could view the end from the beginning, by becoming born human, he restricted himself to being conscious of the fourth dimension only one moment at a time. As a human, Jesus, the Word of God, exercised all the authority he had, authority that had not been diminished through human failings, even to the point of death. That death was the event that absorbed the shock waves that saved the universe, the ultimate slap on the floor. Not only did it save four-dimensional space-time, but it left a surplus of energy that enabled the resurrection of the dead. We'll go more into this in another podcast. We'll also deal with the objections that often come up when discussing the existence of God and his dealings with humanity. We'll look at the question of whether the assertion of that God is righteous and loving, and that he is at the same time omnipotent, and are contradictory. While I don't operate under the illusion that one can prove the existence of God to an atheist by argument, I hope that we can answer some of the objections that often come up and show that at least believing in him as we do isn't a theological oxymoron. We'll also go more into what this all means. Meanwhile, feel free to visit me on my website, robbycharters.co.uk. That's my name, Robbie, spelled with a Y, Charters. Apparently, in the vast Charters clan, I'm the only Robbie who spells his name with a Y. So if you Google my first and last name, you'll mainly find my stuff. I have a few novels, including a graphic novel that I've just finished, and soon, hopefully, a few more of these videos. Anyway, until next time,